Ko nā tauki matawhauru e te waka, ko hokeanga nui a kupe te moana, ko whakatere manawa kai ai e te maonga, ko moi hau te awa, ko tuhirangi te marae, ko nā puhi tutu mahuri huri a hau, ko rāhere te tangata, ko Rob Small taku ingoa. Tēnā koutou katoa. Today I'm going to talk about the Kūmara that were planted here and the way that it was traditionally planted by my tūpuna in a rā o mua in the old days. So much of the information which I've used in my research into growing Kūmara, but also the whole aspect of Tikanga Māori in the Mara, has come from this particular book, which was written by Elsden Best in 1924 and was a piece of work commissioned by the National Museum. And while it's got some awful colonial connotations, a lot of the information which Elsden Best gathered from talking to Matua across the Motu is really very valid today. And so it's a treasure trove of chants, of explanations of how various of their pre-colonial crops were grown. And so it's this particular text that I've used in much of my work in terms of the work I'm doing with Kūmara here at Dignan Street, but also at Pauriwa. And in particular, some of the really rich stuff that's in here is the rituals around lifting Kūmara, around the chants they used when they had the core and they were digging the rows in unison. And so the work of growing Kūmara was never solitary. It was always everybody got involved. So I used this particular chant when I'm actually planting Kūmara, and it's an ancient chant, and it goes like this. He mara tautana, he mara tapu, toto te hiki rauka tauri, rauka tā kātamia, mā hiti mā rekareka. Tēnei te hāpai ka hāpai, ko te hāpai nā wai, ko te hāpai nā rongo. Rongo ua kina, rongo te kāinga ki rangi nui, ki rangi roa, ki rangi rāka hia. Mai taku kiti nei, he mana nea taku kiti nei, totoro tahu totoro te hua I wainganui, kia ka whiti, kia ka toa. Haere te kākano, ko te kura mai e whaia, ko te kura mai e mata te rā. He hururutanga, he nā torutanga, ai. So that's the chant that I generally use at the time when I'm beginning to plant Kūmara, which of course has to coincide with one of those days in Maramataka when it's most auspicious. It's usually on a waning moon when there's a high energy. Times like Otane is ideal. But you'll find that it's got, here are some representations of pani, which usually go into the maratautani. The maratautani is the small garden that's set aside to honour the atua that are associated with Kūmara. So this is pani and rongo matane. Rongo is the deity responsible for cultivated foods, but also for peace. And those things go so nicely together, don't they? In the old days, when Kūmara first came to Aotearoa with the Polynesian people, they were highly dependent on those food sources. And if, in fact, they didn't survive, they were in a lot of difficulty. So when they planted Kūmara, and indeed when they planted anything, they were extremely strict about the rituals and about the methodology that they used. This was very important to them so that it could be passed on from generation to generation. Also important in passing that on were what my ancestors called matauranga. Now matauranga Māori is a complex thing. It is about knowledge. It is about learning. It is about rangahau, about research. And in the old days when there was no written language, the way they would pass that information on would be through what they call pūrākau, or taonga e tuku, treasures given forward. These are the mātauranga. These are the wise words that were passed on from generation to generation to make sure that those exact processes could be replicated. It's a very complicated thing because in many ways the way they were put down was with the language of its time, and today we have modernised some of te reo Māori, particularly as it's taught through the educational institutions. But also at that time the language was extremely poetic, and so in many ways things were referred to in metaphors and other instruments, so that when these things were told they could be passed on exactly. Here in the Mara Kūmara, it was very important to recognise a couple of things. One was the way they planted the Kūmara was in what we call puki, little hills. And those little hills were created because they would never plant a garden right adjacent to the village, to their papakainga. They would take those things that they were planting and plant them away, so that if a tribe came seeking vengeance or something, some act of reprisal, then they wouldn't necessarily find their food and steal it. So because they carried some of the things to amend the soils that they used some distance, gravels to make heavy soils lighter and the like, they just formed, instead of forming a big windrow, they just formed hills. There was less material to bring, quite obviously, but also it allowed them to build up the engine room where the Kūmara would be produced, those mounds, those puke. The other thing that was really important is they wanted to maximise the use of the ground they had. So the way they planted the puke was basically in like a figure 5 on a dice. So it was, and they call that the quincunx pattern. It was remarked on by Cook and his botanists and other people who travelled around New Zealand, who were the first Europeans to, as far as we know, to come into these waters. And they remarked how amazingly tidy the gardens were, how absolutely exact were the rows of puke in that quincunx pattern. And if you ever go and visit the Te Parapara Gardens in Hamilton Gardens, which Wiremu Puke and his father had a big hand in producing, you'll see a very exacting pattern in that mara. It's really worth a look. So here we are in our mara Kūmara. The runners will grow out and drape along the sides, and regularly during the season we either come and trim those or we lift them so that they're not rooting, because this is where the action happens, right in here. That's where all the Kūmara will form, and I'll talk shortly about how we plant them and why it's important the way they go into Papatuanuku to produce the best crops. But in these tipu you can plant between 1 and 3 plants. We've planted 3. We have a super abundance of tipu this year, but quite often only 1 or 2 would be planted. So here we have the shoots. These are called tipu, and they are grown, and this is how you'd buy them from your plant shop or wherever else. But the way they're grown is to take a Kūmara and to bury it, if you like, in a tray or an outside area. In a good potting mix is the best, but some people use sawdust. The main thing is to keep it moist, and what we've done is to generally plant them in a crate with paper around the outside, and then to cover it with a sheeting that won't allow the water to do anything but evaporate and moisturise the medium. So eventually these will grow from one end of the Kūmara plant itself, or the Kūmara tuber itself, or even from where there's an eye, and eventually they'll grow up through that mix and they'll make the roots like that. So this one is the more common Awairaka, but we've identified 17 different cultivars around the motu, and right now we're growing those at Porua. But at one time, Elston Best quotes about 52 named varieties, some of which might have just been duplicates of plants grown by different iwi. So here are the tipu, and if I were to plant them, the most important thing to know when you plant a Kūmara is that it is off this part of the stem. Whatever part of the stem is horizontal will produce Kūmara. So that it's very important when you're planting to get this part of the stem as flat as you can and get as much of it in the ground as you can, because that gives you more abundant Kūmara. The way typically it's done is you take the Kūmara in your hand like so, and I'll just show you on the side of this tipu, is to put it in, so it's in your hand like that. You go down and you pull it along like so, and you plant it like that. You can put more of the tipu in if you want to, but the whole point is to make sure that as much of that stem is horizontal as possible. That's the really important thing to give you the best crops. The other thing I should say about Kūmara is they really like a solid base. So I have heard of people who've grown Kūmara on mounds like this on concrete. At Porua, where I'm also involved, we plant them on cardboard and then build our mounds or our tipu up on top of that. But if you've got a good, hard base, as we do have here at Dignan Street, then it's all fine. So if you want to have a crack at that, that'd be great, and have a good crop.